The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, continued. He could not restrain himself and artlessly expressed his admiration. "But you've got a fine pair of boots." The cornet did not feel inclined to enter into friendly conversation. With a sneer and a challenge in his voice, he said, "You wanted to change your foreign equipment for the Moscow bast shoes, so you've got no reason to covet other people's now." "We made a mistake. We've admitted it, and we've been punished," the Cossack said in a disconcerted tone, looking round at the other Cossacks in search of support. The cornet went on sneeringly with his lecture. "You showed you've got bullock's brains. A bullock's always like that. He shifts first and stops to think afterwards. Made a mistake. But when you laid the front bare in the autumn, what were you thinking of then? You wanted to be commissars. Fine defenders of the fatherland you were." "Drop it. That's enough," a youthful-looking company commander quietly whispered into the fuming cornet's ear. The cornet trod on his cigarette, spat, and with a rolling gait went off to the horses. The captain handed him a note and said something in an undertone. With unexpected ease, the heavily built cornet leaped on his horse, turned the animal sharply, and galloped off westward. The Cossacks maintained a disconcerted silence. The captain came up to them and asked in a ringing, cheery baritone, "How far is it to the village of Varvarinsky?" "Nearly 25 miles, several of the Cossacks answered in an assortment of voices. "Good. Well now, Cossacks, go and inform your commander that the cavalry forces are to cross to this side without a moment's delay. One of our officers will go with you to the crossing, and he will lead the cavalry. The infantry can advance on Kazanska in marching order. Understand? Well, as we say, about turn and quick march." The Cossacks went in a crowd down the hill. For perhaps 200 yards they strode along in silence, as though by agreement. But then a homely-looking Cossack in a peasant's coat, the same man whom the zealous cornet had lectured, shook his head and sighed mournfully. "Well, so we're united again, brothers." A second excitedly added, "A horseradish is no sweeter than a radish," and he swore juicily. Chapter 12. As soon as the news that the Red forces were in retreat arrived at Vyashenska, Griegor Melyukov and 2 cavalry regiments swam their horses across the Don, sent out strong patrols, and moved southward. Fighting was going on beyond the Donside hills. They could hear the blended roar of gunfire thundering muffledly, as though underground. "You can see the cadets don't spare the shells. They're putting down a barrage," one of the commanders said in an admiring tone as he rode up to Griegor. Griegor held his peace. He was riding ahead of the column, gazing about him attentively. For a distance of 2 miles from the Don to Bazki hamlet, thousands of light carts and wagons left behind by the insurgents were strewn along the road. Everywhere in the forest lay scattered possessions: broken chests, tables, clothing, harness, domestic utensils, sewing machines, sacks of grain, all the things that in a great lust for household property had been snatched up and carried so far in the retreat to the Don. In places the road was littered knee-high with golden wheat, and here and there were the swollen, stinking carcasses of bullocks and horses, horribly distorted with decay. "There's fine husbandry for you," Griegor exclaimed, shocked at the sight. Baring his head, trying not to breathe, he cautiously rode round a little mound of fusty grain, over which the body of an old man in a Cossack cap and a blood-stained coat was stretched. "That old man's kept guard to the end over his goods. The devils must have bewitched him into staying here," one of the Cossacks said compassionately. "He couldn't bring himself to leave the wheat behind." "Well, move on at a trot. He stinks like God knows what." "Hey, get a move on," came indignant shouts from the ranks in the rear. The squadron broke into a trot. The talk died away. Only the clatter of innumerable horse hoofs and the jingle of tightly strapped Cossack equipment rang in accord through the forest. There was fighting going on not far from the Listnitsky's estate. The Red Army men were running in a dense crowd along a waterless valley to one side of Yagodnoye. Shrapnel was bursting above their heads, machine guns were firing at their backs, and a stream of men from a Kalmyk regiment poured over the hill to cut off their retreat. Griegor arrived with his regiments when the battle was over. The 2 Red Army companies covering the retreat of the shattered forces and baggage trains of the 14th Mironov Division were smashed by the Kalmyk regiment and completely destroyed. On the heights above the valley, Griegor remarked as he handed over the command to Yermakov, "They've managed here without us. You go and make contact. I'm just going to slip along to that estate for a moment." "What for?" Yermakov asked in surprise. "Well, that's difficult to say. I worked here when I was a youngster, and something draws me to take a look at the old spots." Calling Prokhor, Griegor turned in the direction of Yagodnoye. They had ridden a quarter of a mile when, looking back, he saw a white sheet which one of the Cossacks had thoughtfully brought along, fluttering in the wind at the head of the squadrons. "It looks just as though they were surrendering," Griegor thought anxiously, and he watched with a vague yearning at his heart as slowly, almost it seemed reluctantly, the column dropped into the valley towards a mounted group of Sekretov men who were riding at a trot straight across the grass to meet them. An air of mournfulness and neglect welcomed Griegor as through the tumble-down gateway he rode into the courtyard. The yard was overgrown with goosefoot. Yagodnoye was unrecognizable. Everywhere he saw signs of terrible neglect and ruin. The once handsome house was dingy and almost seemed to have sunk on its foundations. The long, unpainted roof was marked with yellow patches of rust. Broken gutter pipes hung from the eaves. The shutters were hanging awry, half off their hinges. The wind tore with a whistle through the shattered windows, while the sour, moldy smell of a place long uninhabited came from the rooms. The eastern corner of the house, together with the porch, had been demolished by a shell from a 3-inch gun. The crown of a maple, bowled over by the shell, was thrust into the broken Venetian window of the corridor. So it had been left lying, its butt buried in a heap of bricks torn up from the foundations. Along its faded branches, a wild hop was already crawling and twining exuberantly. Whimsically overgrowing the panes still left whole, it reached up to the cornice. Time and weather had done their work. The yard buildings had rotted and looked as though solicitous human hands had not touched them for many a year. The stone wall of the stable had fallen, washed down by the spring rains. A storm had torn off the roof of the coach-house, and only here and there were handfuls of half-rotten straw left on the spectrally bleached rafters and cross-beams. 3 savage barzois were lying on the steps of the servants' quarters. Seeing human beings, they jumped up and, barking hoarsely, vanished into the porch. Griegor rode up to the wide-open window of the servants' wing, bent across from his saddle, and called, "Is there any living soul here?" There was a long silence, but at last a woman's strained voice answered, "Wait a bit, for the love of Christ. I'll be out in a minute." Shuffling along on bare feet, the aged Lucaria came to the steps. Screwing up her eyes to keep out the sunlight, she stood gazing long at Griegor. "Don't you know me, Auntie Lucaria?" Griegor asked as he dismounted. Only then did a tremor pass over Lucaria's pock-marked face, and the look of dull indifference gave place to one of terrible agitation. She burst into tears, and for a long time could not utter a word. Griegor tethered his horse and waited patiently. "The things I've suffered, God grant that I may never again suffer like it," Lucaria began to lament, rubbing her cheeks with a dirty canvas apron. "I thought it was them arrived again. Ah, Grisha, the things that have happened here you'd never believe. Only me is left." "Why, where's Grandad Sashka? Did he retreat with the masters? If he had, he might have been alive still. Surely he's not dead. They killed him. He's been lying in the cellar these past 3 days. He ought to be buried, but I fell ill. I had to force myself up to answer you just now. and I'm mortally afraid to go to him, to the dead." "What did they do it for?" Griegor asked thickly, not raising his eyes from the ground. "It was over the mare. The masters left in a hurry. They only took their money, and they left almost all the property with me." Luceria's voice dropped to a whisper. "I kept everything, down to the last thread. It still lies buried to this day, and they only took 3 Orloff stallions from the horses and left the others with Grandad Sashka. When the rising began, the horses were taken by both Cossacks and Reds. The Raven stallion Whirlwind, I expect you remember him, was taken by the Reds in the spring. They had a struggle to get the saddle on him. You know he'd never been broken into a saddle, but they were not destined to ride him, to triumph over him. Some Kargin Cossacks arrived here a week later and told us about it. On the hill they ran into the Reds and began to fire at them. The Cossacks had got some silly little mare with them, and just at that moment she began to whinny, and Whirlwind flew like wildfire to the mare, and the man riding him couldn't hold him in at all. He saw he couldn't control the stallion, and so he tried to jump off while in full gallop. He jumped off all right, but he failed to get his foot out of the stirrup. So Whirlwind dragged him right into the hands of the Cossacks." "Fine!" Prokhor exclaimed enthusiastically. "Now a Kargin lieutenant's riding the stallion," Luceria continued measuredly with her story. "He's promised that as soon as Master arrives, he'll return Whirlwind to the stable. And so they took away all the horses, and only the trotting horse Arrow was left. She was in foal, and so nobody touched her. She only dropped the foal recently, and old Sashka took such great care of that little foal you wouldn't believe. He carried it about in his arms and gave it milk and some herb potion from a horn to make it stronger on its legs. And then trouble came on us. 3 days ago 3 men rode up late in the afternoon. Sashka was mowing grass in the orchard. They shouted at him, 'Come here, you this and that.' He threw down his scythe, went over and greeted them, but they wouldn't look at him, only drank milk and asked him, 'Have you got any horses?' And he said, 'We've got one, but she's no good for your military work. She's a mare, and she's suckling a foal.' The most savage of the 3 shouted, 'That's nothing to do with you. Bring the mare here, you old devil. My horse has got a chafed back, and I've got to change her.' Sashka should have submitted and not stood out over the mare, but you know what a character the old man was. There were times when the master himself couldn't make him hold his tongue. I expect you remember." "And so he didn't hand her over?" Prokhor intervened in the story. "Why, how could he help handing her over? He only said to them, 'Before you came, we've had I don't know how many horsemen come and take away all the horses, but they all had pity on this one, so why should you?' That made them angry. 'But they say, you lick-spittle, that you're keeping her for your master.' Well, and they pulled him away. One of them led out the mare and began to saddle her, and the foal crawled under her to the teat. Old Sashka began to plead, 'Have pity, don't take her. Where is the foal to go?' 'I'll show you where,' another of them said, and drove the foal away from its mother, slipped his rifle from his shoulder and fired at it. I burst into tears. I ran up and pleaded with them, and I got hold of Sashka and tried to lead him out of trouble. But as he looked at the foal, his little beard began to shake. He went as white as a wall and said, 'If that's the case, then shoot me too, you son of a bitch.' He rushed at them and clung to them and wouldn't let them saddle the mare, and they went mad and killed him on the spot. I was near crazed when they fired at him, and now I can't think what to do about him. He ought to have a coffin made, but is that woman's work?" "Bring us 2 spades and some canvas," Griegor asked. "Are you thinking of burying him?" Prokhor inquired. "Yes." "A fine idea, taking that on yourself, Griegor Pantelyevich. Let me go and fetch some Cossacks at once. They'll make a coffin and dig him a proper grave." It was obvious that Prokhor had no desire to be bothered with the burial of some unknown old man, but Griegor resolutely rejected his suggestion. "We'll dig the grave and bury him ourselves. Old Sashka was a good sort. Go into the orchard and wait for me by the lake while I go and have a look at him." Under the same poplar, with its roots spreading over the ground, by the duck-weeded pond where Sashka had once buried Griegor's and Aksinia's little daughter, the old man found his own last resting place. They wrapped his withered body in a clean sheet, used for covering leaven and smelling of hops, laid it in the grave, and filled in the earth. Beside the infant's mound rose yet another, neatly trodden down by Cossack boots, gleaming cheerfully with fresh, damp clay. Numbed with memories, Griegor lay down on the grass not far from this tiny, dearly cherished cemetery, and gazed long at the majestic expanse of blue sky above him. Somewhere in the heights of that infinite space winds were wandering, chilly clouds gleaming with sunlight were floating along. But on the earth which had just taken the merry ostler and drunkard, Sashka, to itself, life was still seething as furiously as ever. On the steppe, stealing in a flood of green to the very edge of the orchard, and in the tangle of wild flax around the borders of the ancient threshing floor, he could hear the incessant quiet rattle of struggling quails. Marmots were whistling, bumblebees were humming, the grass was rustling beneath the wind's caresses, the skylarks were singing in the spurting light of the sunset, and to confirm the grandeur of man's place in nature, somewhere a long way off in the valley, a machine gun stuttered insistently, angrily, and hollowly. Chapter 13. General Sekretov, who arrived in Vyashenska with his staff officers and a personal escort of a squadron of Cossacks, was welcomed hospitably with bread and salt, and with the ringing of church bells. The bells of both the churches were rung all day by anyone who cared to go up into the belfries and ring, just as at Easter time. Cossacks from the lower Don rode through the streets on meager Don horses, exhausted with long marches. Close to the merchant's house, where the general had taken up his quarters, a crowd of orderlies was standing in the square. Husking sunflower seeds, they made conversation with the village girls passing by in their Sunday best. The church bells were rung, and vodka drunk in Vyashenska until dusk fell. But in the evening, the insurgent command organized a banquet for the new arrivals, holding it in the house set aside for the officers' mess. The tall, well-built Sekretov, a Cossack of Cossacks, a native of one of the hamlets in the Krasnokutsk district, was passionately fond of riding horses. He was a superb rider and a dashing cavalry general, but he was no speaker. The speech he made at the banquet was filled with drunken bragging and included unequivocal reproaches and threats addressed to the Upper Don Cossacks. Griegor, who was present at the banquet, listened tensely and angrily to Sekretov's words. The general, still not quite sober, stood resting his fingers on the table, sending the scented vodka sprinkling from his glass, giving superfluous emphasis to every phrase. No, it is not we who ought to thank you for help, but you who ought to thank us. You and only you. That has got to be said plainly. Without us, the Reds would have annihilated you. You know very well. But we would have crushed the scum without you, and we are crushing it and will crush it, bear that in mind, until we have cleaned up all Russia. In the autumn you abandoned the front. You let the Bolsheviks enter the Cossack lands. You wanted to live at peace with them, but you couldn't. And so you rose to save your property, your lives. Putting it bluntly, you were afraid of your own and your cattle's hides. I recall the past not in order to reproach you with your sins. I do not say this to you to offend you, but it never does any harm to establish the truth. We have pardoned your betrayal. As brothers, we have come to you at your most difficult moment. We have come to your help. But your shameful past must be redeemed in the future. You understand, gentlemen? You must redeem it with your exploits, and with irreproachable service to our gentle River Don. You understand? Well, here's to the redemption, an elderly Cossack officer sitting opposite Griegor said to nobody in particular, smiling almost imperceptibly. Not waiting for the others, he was the first to drink. He had a manly face, a little scarred with smallpox, and humorous, deep brown eyes. During Sekretov's speech, his lips more than once twisted into an indefinite, lurking smile, and then his eyes darkened and seemed jet black. As he watched this officer, Griegor noticed that he was on familiar terms with Sekretov and behaved very off-handedly towards him, while he was markedly restrained and cold in his relations with the other officers. He alone was wearing khaki epaulets sewn to a khaki tunic, and Kornilov chevrons on his sleeves. A man with ideals, Griegor thought, probably a volunteer. The Cossack officer drank like a horse. He did not eat anything, yet he did not get drunk, only let out his broad British belt from time to time. "Who is that sitting opposite me, the pockmarked fellow?" Griegor whispered to Bogatyrev, who was sitting next to him. "The devil knows," Bogatyrev, who was well on the way to getting drunk, evaded the question. Kudinov did not spare the vodka for his guests. Liquor appeared on the table, and Sekretov, who had difficulty in finishing his speech, threw open his khaki coat and dropped heavily into his armchair. A young company commander with an obviously Mongolian type of face leaned across to him and whispered something. "Go to the devil," Sekretov answered, turning livid, and he tossed off the glass of liquor Kudinov had complacently poured out. "And who's that with the slanting eyes? An adjutant?" Griegor asked Bogatyrev. Covering his mouth with his palm, his companion answered, "No, that's Sekretov's adopted son. He brought him back as a boy from Manchuria during the Japanese War. He brought him up and sent him to a Junkers military school. And the boy's made good. He's a daring devil. Yesterday he captured the Reds' treasure chests close to Makievka. He grabbed 2 millions in notes. Look, you can see packets of them sticking out of all his pockets. The devil struck it lucky, an absolute treasure. But drink up, what are you staring about you for?" Kudinov made a speech in reply, but hardly anyone listened to him. The carousal grew more and more uncontrolled. Throwing off his jacket, Sekretov sat in his waistcoat. His clean-shaven head glittered with sweat, and his irreproachably spotless linen shirt more and more set off his purpled face and almost olive-colored, sunburnt neck. Kudinov whispered something to him, but Sekretov obstinately repeated without looking at him, "No, excuse me, but you must excuse me. We trust you, but only insofar as your treachery will not quickly be forgotten. Let all those who played about with the Reds in the autumn engrave that on their memories." "Well, but we, in our turn, shall serve you only insofar as," the intoxicated Griegor thought with cold fury. He rose to his feet. Not putting on his cap, he went out onto the porch, and with a feeling of relief, with all his lungs, he breathed in the fresh night air. Down by the dawn, the frogs were tumultuous, and the water beetles were grumpily humming, as before rain. On a spit of sand, snipe were calling to one another. Somewhere afar off in the waterside reeds, a foal, which had lost its mother, was neighing in thin, long drawn-out tones. "Bitter need has betrothed you to us. Otherwise we wouldn't have wanted so much as a smell of you. The accursed scum. He swells up like a penny piece of gingerbread and reproaches us, and in a week's time he'll start treading on our necks. What is done is done. It's all as I thought. It was bound to be so. But now the Cossacks will turn up their noses. They've got out of the habit of saluting and standing to attention before their excellencies." Griegor thought as he went down the steps and groped his way towards the wicket gate. The liquor had had its effect on him also. His head was swimming, his movements acquired an uncertain heaviness. As he passed through the wicket gate he reeled, clapped his cap on his head, and dragging his feet walked down the street. Close to the little house belonging to Aksinia's aunt, he halted for a moment hesitantly, then resolutely strode towards the door. The inner door leading to the porch was not fastened. He walked into the best room without knocking, and directly before him saw Stepan Astachov sitting at the table. Aksinia's aunt was busy at the stove. The table was covered with a clean tablecloth, and on it stood an unfinished bottle of homemade vodka and some pieces of rosy pink dried fish on a plate. Stepan had just emptied his glass, and evidently was about to have a smoke. But seeing Griegor, he pushed away his plate and leaned his back against the wall. Though Griegor was drunk, he noticed Stepan's face turn deathly pale, and saw his eyes flame wolfishly. Dumbfounded by the meeting, Griegor yet found strength enough to remark hoarsely, "You've been doing yourself well?" "Glory be," the housewife answered in alarm, undoubtedly fully aware of Griegor's relations with her kinswoman, and not expecting any good to come from this chance meeting of husband and lover. Stepan silently stroked his whiskers with his left hand, and kept his burning eyes fixed on Griegor. But Griegor, standing with feet set wide apart on the threshold, smiled wryly and said, "Well, I just looked in. You must excuse me." Stepan was silent. The awkward silence lasted until the housewife plucked up courage enough to invite Griegor to stop. "Come in and sit down," she said. Now Griegor had nothing to conceal. His arrival at Aksinia's house was explanation enough to Stepan, and he marched straight into the breach. "But where's your wife?" "Have you come to see her, then?" Stepan asked quietly but distinctly, and dropped his fluttering eyelashes over his eyes. "Yes, that's right," Griegor admitted with a sigh. He was ready for anything at that moment, and, growing sober, prepared to defend himself. But Stepan half opened his eyes, their previous fire had faded, and said, "I've sent her for some vodka. She'll be back in a minute. Sit down and wait." He went so far as to rise, revealing his tall, well-built figure, and he pushed a chair towards Griegor. Not looking at the housewife, he asked, "Auntie, bring us a clean glass." And to Griegor, "You'll have a drink, won't you?" "Just one glass." "Well, sit down." Griegor sat down at the table. Stepan shared out the rest of the vodka equally in the glasses, and raised his strangely misty eyes to Griegor. "Here's to everybody, and their health." They clinked glasses together. They drank. They were silent for some time. The housewife, as nimble as a mouse, handed the guest a plate and a fork with a dented handle. "Have some fish," she said. "It's mild cured." "No, thank you." "Go on, put some on the plate and enjoy it." The woman, now greatly cheered, urged him. She was pleased beyond expression that all was passing off so well, without a fight, without the smashing of crockery, without shouting. The ominous exchange of remarks had stopped. Now they were eating silently, not looking at each other. The prudent housewife took a clean hand towel from the chest, and in a sense united Griegor with Stepan by laying the two ends across their knees. "Why aren't you with your company?" Griegor asked, studying the fish. "I've come on a visit, too," Stepan said after a momentary pause, and from his tone it was quite impossible to determine whether he were serious or sarcastic. "The company's back at home, I suppose. They're all enjoying themselves in the village." "Well, shall we finish our drink?" "All right. Your health. Good luck." In the porch the door latch rattled. Now quite sober, Griegor glanced from under his brows at Stepan, and noticed that a pallor again washed over his face. Aksinia entered, her head wrapped in an embroidered kerchief. Not noticing Griegor, she approached the table and took a side glance at him. Terror spurted in her black, dilated eyes. She panted, then said with an effort, "Greetings, Griegor Pantelyevich." Stepan's great angular hands, which were resting on the table, began to tremble. Griegor silently bowed to Aksinia, not letting fall one word. Setting 2 bottles of homemade vodka on the table, she again threw Griegor a glance full of anxiety and secret joy, turned and went into the dark corner of the room, sat down on the chest, and tidied her hair with trembling hands. Mastering his agitation, Stepan unbuttoned his shirt collar, which seemed to be choking him, filled the glasses to the brim, and turned to his wife. "Take a glass and sit down at the table." "I don't want any." "Come and sit down." "But I don't drink vodka, Stepan." "How many times have I got to tell you?" Stepan's voice shook. "Sit down, neighbor." Griegor smiled encouragingly. She gave him a pleading glance and swiftly went to the cupboard. A dish fell from the shelf and crashed on the floor. "Ah, what a pity!" The housewife clapped her hands in chagrin. Aksenia silently gathered up the fragments. Stepan filled her glass also to the brim, and once more his eyes flamed up with yearning and hatred. "Well, let's drink," he began, and was silent. In the silence, Aksenia's violent and spasmodic breathing as she sat down at the table was clearly audible. "We'll drink, wife, to a long parting." "Why, don't you want to? Won't you drink?" "But you know—" "I know everything now." "Well then, not to any parting. Here's to the health of our dear guest, Griegor Pantelyevich." "Yes, I'll drink his health," Aksenia said in a ringing voice, and tossed off her glass at one gulp. "You've got a stupid headpiece," the housewife muttered, running out into the kitchen. She huddled into a corner and pressed her hands to her breast, waiting for the table to go flying with a crash, for a shot to roar deafeningly. But in the best room, the silence was as of the grave. The only sound to be heard was that of the flies, disturbed by the light buzzing below the ceiling, while outside the window the cocks called to one another, welcoming the midnight all over the village. Dark are the nights of June along the dawn. In the oppressive silence, the golden summer lightning flashes over the slaty black sky. Stars fall and are reflected in the flowing swiftness of the river. From the steppe, a dry, warm wind brings the honeyed perfume of the flowering thyme to the human habitations. And in the low-lying riverside, there is a vapid scent of damp grass, of silt, of rawness. The corncrakes cry unceasingly, and the riverside forest is all covered with a silvery brocade of mist as in a fairy story. Prokhor awoke at midnight. He asked the master of the house in which they were quartered, "Hasn't our man arrived?" "Not yet. He's enjoying himself with the generals." "I expect they're having a good time with the vodka there." Prokhor sighed enviously, and yawning began to dress. "Where are you off to?" "I'm going to water the horses and give them some grain. Pantelyevich said that they were riding to Tatarsk at sunrise. We shall spend the day there, and then we'll have to catch up with our forces." "It's a long time yet to sunrise. You might wait until the sky begins to lighten." In a dissatisfied voice, Prokhor answered, "Anyone can see with half an eye that you weren't in the army when you were young, old man. In our service, if we weren't to feed the horses and look after them, we might not come through alive. You can't go all out at a gallop on a half-starved little nag, can you? The better the beast under you, the swifter you can get away from the enemy. That's me all over. There's no need for me to overtake them, but if we find ourselves in a tight corner, then I'm the first to show my heels. I've had my face to the bullets for so many years now that I've had enough. Light a light, old man, or I'll never find my leg rags." "Thanks." "Yes, our Griegor Pantelyevich now. He's carried off all the crosses and orders and dived head first into hell. But I'm not such a fool. I've got no need of them. Well, the devils take charge of him. I expect he's drunk into the bargain." There was a gentle knock at the door. "Come in," Prokhor shouted. A Cossack with the epaulets of a junior non-commissioned officer on his khaki tunic and wearing a peaked cap with a cockade came in. "I'm an orderly from General Sekretov's staff. Can I see His Excellency Mr. Melyakov?" he asked, saluting and standing at attention at the door. "He's not here," Prokhor answered, amazed at the well-trained orderly's bearing and manner of address. "But don't stretch your bones like that. When I was a youngster, I was just as foolish as you. I'm his orderly." "But what do you want him for?" "I have been commanded by General Sekretov to see Mr. Melyakov. He has requested to present himself at once to the house of the officers' mess." "He went there early in the evening." "He was there, but later he left and went home." Prokhor whistled and winked at the master sitting on the bed. "Get that, old man? He's slipped away, which means he's gone to his darling. Well, you can go, soldier. I'll find him and send him there hot-foot." Telling the old man to water the horses and give them grain, Prokhor set off for the house of Aksenia's aunt. The district center of Yashenska was sleeping in an impenetrable darkness. On the farther side of the dawn, the nightingales were whistling, outvying one another in the forest. Unhurryingly, Prokhor went up to the well-known little hut, entered the porch, and had just taken hold of the door latch when he heard Stepan's deep voice. "Now I'm in a hole," thought Prokhor. "He'll want to know what I've come for, and I'll have nothing to say. Well, it can't be helped. I'll say I came out to buy vodka, and the neighbors sent me to this house." Plucking up courage, he entered the best room, and, struck dumb with astonishment, stood silent with gaping mouth. There was Griegor sitting at the same table as Astachov, and, as though there had never been any quarrel between them, sipping cloudy green homemade vodka from a glass. Stepan, a strained smile on his face, looked at Prokhor and said, "What are you standing there gaping for, and not even saying good evening? Have you seen a ghost?" "Something of the sort," Prokhor, still flabbergasted, answered, shifting from foot to foot. "Well, don't be afraid. Come in and sit down," Stepan invited him. "Time won't allow of my sitting down. I've come for you, Griegor Pantelyevich. You're ordered to go to General Sekretov at once." Even before Prokhor's arrival, Griegor had started up several times to go. He had pushed away his glass and risen, but had at once sat down again, afraid Stepan would regard his departure as an open manifestation of cowardice. His pride would not allow him to abandon Aksiniya, to yield place to Stepan. He drank, but the vodka no longer had any effect on him. Soberly realizing all the equivocal nature of his position, he waited for the denouement. For 1 second he had felt sure Stepan would strike Aksiniya when she drank his, Griegor's, health. But he was wrong. Stepan raised his hairy hand, wiped his sunburnt forehead, and after a brief silence glanced in admiration at Aksiniya and said, "You're a great lass, wife. I like you for your daring." Then Prokhor had entered. After a moment's reflection, Griegor decided not to go, thinking he would give Stepan an opportunity to say what was in his mind. "Go and tell him you haven't been able to find me. Understand?" He turned to Prokhor. "I understand all right. Only it would be better if you went, Pantelyevich. That's not your business. Off with you." Prokhor went towards the door, but at that moment Aksiniya unexpectedly intervened. Not looking at Griegor, she said dryly, "But what does this mean? You go with him, Griegor Pantelyevich. Thank you for coming and being our guest, spending some of your time with us. But it's getting late. The second cock has crowed. It'll be dawn soon, and Stepan and I have got to go home at sunrise. And besides, you've had enough drink. No more." Stepan did not try to keep him back, and Griegor rose. As they shook hands, Stepan held Griegor's in his own cold, rough hand, as though at last he wanted to say something. Yet even then he did not speak, but silently watched Griegor to the door, then unhurriedly reached out for the unfinished bottle. The moment Griegor found himself in the street, a terrible weariness took possession of him. Moving his legs with difficulty, he walked as far as the first crossroads, then asked Prokhor, who was following inseparably in his tracks, "Go saddle the horses and bring them here. I shan't go there on foot." "Shall I go and report that you're on the way?" "No." "Well, wait a bit. I'll be back in a moment." This time, the always leisurely Prokhor set off for their quarters at a trot. Griegor sat down by the fence and lit a cigarette. As he mentally reviewed his meeting with Stepan, he unconcernedly thought, "Well, now he knows, so long as he doesn't beat Aksiniya." Then his weariness and the emotional excitement he had experienced forced him to lie down. He dozed off. Prokhor rode up very soon after. They crossed by the ferry to the farther side of the Don and put the horses into a swinging trot. Chapter 14. They rode into Tatarsk at dawn. By the gate of his yard, Griegor dismounted, threw the rein to Prokhor, and, hurryingly agitated, went towards the house. Natalia, half-dressed, happened to come out to the porch for something. At the sight of Griegor, her sleepy eyes blazed up with such a bright, spurting light of joy that his heart beat, and his eyes momentarily unexpectedly moistened. But Natalia silently embraced her beloved one, pressing all her body against his, and by the way her shoulders quivered, Griegor realized that she was weeping. He went into the hut, kissed the old people and the children sleeping in the best room, and stood in the middle of the kitchen. "Well, how did you come through? All well?" he asked, breathing heavily with agitation. "Glory be, my son. We've seen things to put fear into our hearts, but we can't say we've been overmuch troubled," Ilinichna hurriedly answered. Glancing sidelong at the tear-stained Natalia, she harshly shouted at her, "You ought to be glad, and you're crying, you little fool. Now don't stand there doing nothing. Get some wood. Light the stove." While she and Natalia were hastily getting breakfast ready, Panteleimon Prokofyevitch brought his son a clean hand towel and suggested, "You have a wash. I'll pour water into your hands. It freshens up the head. You stink of vodka. I suppose you were celebrating the joyful event yesterday." "We celebrated right enough. Only at the moment it isn't clear whether it is a joyful or a mournful event." "What's that?" The old man was surprised beyond measure. "Why, Sekretov's rather angry with us." "Well, that's no woe. Surely he didn't drink with you, too?" "Yes, he did." "You don't say. The honor you've been done, Grishka, sitting at the same table as a real general, to think of it." Giving his son a tender look, Panteleimon clicked his tongue in delight. Griegor smiled. He did not share his father's naive exultation in the least. As he seriously questioned the old man about the cattle and property, and asked how much damage had been done to the grain, Griegor noticed that his father was not so interested as formerly in talking about the farm. Something more important was weighing on the old man's mind. Something was oppressing him. Panteleimon was not slow in giving expression to his fears. "What's going to happen now, Grisha? Surely we shan't have to serve any more." "Who are you referring to?" "The old men. Me, for instance." "There's nothing definite at present." "So we shall have to go?" "You can stay." "But really?" Panteleimon exclaimed in delight, and went limping about the kitchen in his agitation. "Sit down, you lame devil. Don't carry the dirt on your boots all over the house. You're so overjoyed you're running about like a half-starved whelp," Ilinichna sternly called to him. But the old man paid no attention to her shout. He hobbled several times from the table to the stove, smiling and rubbing his hands. Then he was seized by doubts. "But can you give me my discharge?" "Of course I can." "You'll write me out a document?" "Of course." The old man stammered irresolutely, but at last got out the words, "What sort of document will it be? Without a seal? Or perhaps you've got a seal with you?" "It'll do all right without a seal," Griegor smiled. "Well, then there's no point in talking." The old man again cheered up. "God grant you health. When are you thinking of going off again?" "Tomorrow." The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1, by Mikhail Sholokhov, concluded. The old man again cheered up. "God grant you health. When are you thinking of going off again?" "Tomorrow." "Have your forces gone on ahead?" "Yes, but don't you worry about yourself, Father. In any case, all the old men like you will be allowed to go home soon. You've served your time." "God grant it." Panteleimon crossed himself, evidently now completely reassured. The children woke up. Griegor took them in his arms, seated them on his knees, and kissing them in turn, a smile on his lips, listened long to their merry chatter. How the hair of these children was scented, with sun, with grass, with warm pillows, and with something else infinitely near and dear to him. And they, this flesh of his flesh, were like the tiny steppe-birds. How clumsy seemed his great black hands as they embraced the two children, and how foreign to this peaceful scene did he seem, this horseman who had slipped from his horse for one day, who was soaked through and through with the pungent scent of soldiering and horse's sweat, the sour smell of campaigning and of leather equipment. Griegor's eyes were filmed with a mist of tears. His lips quivered beneath his whiskers. 3 times he failed to answer his father's questions, and he came to the table only when Natalia touched him on the sleeve of his tunic. Truly, Griegor was no longer the man he had been. He had never been particularly sensitive, and had wept rarely even as a child. But now these tears, these muffled, hurried beats of his heart, and the feeling as though a little bell were tolling noiselessly in his throat. For that matter, it may all have been because he had drunk a great deal the previous night, and had had no sleep. Darya returned from driving the cows out to the pasture, and when, after jocularly stroking his whiskers, she put her smiling lips up to Griegor, he brought his face close to hers, and she closed her eyes. He saw her lashes quivering as though under the wind, and for a moment he was conscious of the fusty scent of cream coming from her unfading cheeks. So Darya was the same as ever. It would seem that no sorrow could ever be strong enough even to bow her to the ground, far less to break her. She lived in the world like a red-barked switch of dogwood, flexible, beautiful, and accessible. "So you're flourishing?" Griegor asked. "Like the roadside henbane?" Darya smiled dazzlingly, half-closing her radiant eyes. She at once went over to the mirror to adjust the hair which had broken free of her kerchief, and to smarten herself up. But she had always been like that, had Darya. There was nothing to be done with such a woman, surely. Pyotr's death had had the effect of spurring her on, and as soon as she had recovered from the blow, she had grown still more greedy of life, still more attentive to her outward appearance. They awoke Dunya, who was sleeping in the granary. After crossing themselves, all the family sat down at the table. "Oh, but you've grown old, brother," Dunya said commiseratingly. "You've gone gray as a wolf." Griegor gave her a silent, unsmiling look across the table, and only then said, "So I should. It's for me to grow old, and it's for you to come of age, to look for a husband. But I tell you this, from today on you're to forget even to think about Mishka Koshevoy. If from today on I hear that you're pining for him, I'll step on one of your feet, and I'll take hold of the other, and I'll rip you in two like a little frog, understand?" Dunya flamed up like a carrot, and gazed at Griegor through her tears. He did not turn his angry eyes away from her face, and in all his harsh features, in the teeth bared beneath his mustache, in his narrowed eyes, the innate Melyukhov animal traits emerged still more clearly. But Dunya also was of the same breed. Recovering from her embarrassment and shame, she quietly but resolutely said, "Don't you know, brother, you can't command the heart." "The heart that does not obey you has to be torn out," Griegor advised her coldly. "It's not for you to talk like that, my son," Ilinichna thought. But at that point Panteleimon Prokofyevitch joined in the conversation. He banged his fist down on the table and roared, "You daughter of a bitch, hold your tongue in my presence, or I'll give you such a heart that you won't have a hair left on your head. You hussy, I'll go this minute and get some reins." "But, father, we haven't got one pair of reins left. They've all been taken," Darya interrupted him, a meek look on her face. Panteleimon shot a furious glance at her, and, not lowering his voice, continued to unburden his soul. "I'll get a saddle-girth, and I'll drive all the devils out of you." "The Reds have taken the saddle-girths, too," Darya intervened, this time in a louder voice, but still gazing at her father-in-law with innocent eyes. But that was too much for Panteleimon. He stared at his daughter-in-law for a second, turning livid with dumb fury, his mouth silently gaping. At that moment he looked like a pike hauled out of the water. Then hoarsely shouted, "Shut up, damn you! There's 100 devils in you. They won't let me say a word. What do you call this? But you, Dunya, understand. That sort of thing's unnatural. I speak to you as your father, and Griegor was right. If you go on thinking of such a scoundrel, killing will be too good for you. A fine wooer she's found. A gallows bird has captured her soul. He set fire to half the village. Shot helpless old men. Is that what you call a man? Do you think I'd have such a Judas as my son-in-law? If he ever falls into my hands, I'll hand him over to death myself. Only give me one more back answer, and I'll get a willow switch, and I'll give you—" "Why, you could look all over our yard with a light in broad daylight, and you'd never find a willow switch," Ilinichna said with a sigh. You can roll like a ball into every corner of the yard, and you won't find so much as a twig to light a fire with. That's the state of things we're reduced to." Even in this artless remark, Panteleimon detected an evil intent. He looked fixedly at the old woman, then jumped up like a madman and ran out into the yard. Griegor threw down his spoon, covered his face with his hand-towel, and shook with soundless laughter. His anger had passed, and he laughed as he had laughed in days long past. They all laughed except Dunya. Now a more cheery note reigned at the table, but the moment Panteleimon was heard stamping up the steps of the porch, all their faces grew serious. The old man burst in like a hurricane, dragging a very long alder bough behind him. "There you are! It'll be enough for all the lot of you damned long tongues, you long-tailed vixens. There aren't any switches? Then what's this? And you'll get a taste of it too, you old she-devil. You try giving me—" The branch was too big to be found a place for in the kitchen, and after tipping a pot over, the old man threw it down with a crash in the porch, then, breathing heavily, sat down at the table. His good spirits were gone. He wheezed and ate without speaking. The others were silent also. Darya did not raise her eyes from the table for fear of bursting into laughter. Ilinichna sighed and whispered almost inaudibly, "O Lord, Lord, heavy and grievous are our sins." Only Dunya did not feel like smiling, while Natalia, who, while the old man was outside, had smiled a queer, labored smile, again grew abstracted and sorrowful. "Pass the salt, the bread," Panteleimon occasionally bellowed menacingly, sweeping his glittering eyes over his family. The family quarrel ended in a decidedly unusual fashion. In the general silence, Mishatka gave his grandfather fresh cause for offense. He had often heard his grandmother call his grandfather all kinds of nasty things when they were quarreling, and childishly upset because his grandfather was talking of thrashing everybody, and was bawling all over the kitchen, he suddenly remarked in a ringing voice, his nostrils quivering, "The way you carry on, you lame devil, you need a stick about your head to make you stop frightening us and grandmother." "Did you say that to me? To your grandfather?" "Yes, to you," Mishatka declared valiantly. "But how dare you use such words to your own grandfather?" "Well, what are you making all that noise for?" "What a little devil!" Stroking his beard, Panteleimon ran his eyes in amazement around the room. "And he's picked up all that talk from you, you old hag. It's you who teaches him." "Who teaches him? He's just as uncontrollable as you and his father," Ilinichna angrily defended herself. Natalia rose and spanked Mishatka, instructing him the while, "You're not to talk to your granddad like that, do you hear?" Mishatka began to bellow and buried his face on Griegor's knees. But Panteleimon, who had not expected such spirit in his grandchild, jumped up from the table, and, tears streaming from his eyes, not wiping away the tears running down over his beard, joyously shouted, "Grishka, my son, son of your mother, the old woman said truly. It's ours all right. It's the Melyukov blood. That's when the blood shows. No one can pass that by in silence. Little grandson, my darling, here, beat the old fool with whatever you like. Drag him about by his beard." Snatching Mishatka away from Griegor, the old man lifted the boy high above his head. They finished breakfast and rose from the table. The women began to wash up, but Panteleimon lit a cigarette and said to Griegor, "It's sort of awkward to ask you, for you're only here on a visit, but what else can I do? Give me a hand with setting up the fence and barring off the threshing floor, for everything's fallen down. And you can't ask strangers just now. They're all in the same state." Griegor willingly agreed, and the two of them worked in the yard until dinner time, putting the fencing in order. As they drove in a paling, the old man said, "It's time to mow, but I don't know whether to get in more grass or not. What do you think in regard to the farm? Is it worth the bother? For after all, in a month's time the Reds may be calling on us again, and everything will go to those devils once more." "I don't know, Father," Griegor frankly admitted. "I don't know what turn events may take and who's going to win. Carry on so that you've got nothing to spare, either in the bins or in the yard. At such times as these, it's all for nothing. Take my father-in-law, for instance. All his life he strained his throat, he made money, he sweated the blood out of himself and out of others, and what is left of it all? Only charred stumps in the yards. "That's just what I was thinking, lad," the old man agreed, suppressing a sigh. He made no further attempt to talk about the farm, only just after noonday, noticing that Griegor was taking extra pains over fixing up the gate to the threshing floor, he said in a chagrined and openly bitter tone, "Just do it anyhow. What are you taking all that trouble for? It hasn't got to stand for a lifetime." Evidently, only now was the old man realizing all the futility of his efforts to organize his life along the old lines. Just before sunset, Griegor stopped work and went into the house. Natalia was alone in the best room. She had dressed herself up as though for a holiday. Her blue woolen skirt and dove-blue poplin jacket with embroidery at the breast and with lace cuffs fitted her neatly. Her face was tenderly rosy, and shone a little after a recent wash with soap. She was looking for something in the chest, but when she saw Griegor she dropped the lid and straightened up with a smile. Griegor sat down on the chest and said, "Sit down for a while, for I'm off tomorrow, and we shan't have had any talk together." She humbly sat down at his side, looking at him sidelong, with eyes a little startled. But he unexpectedly took her hand and said in a caressing tone, "But you're as smooth as if you'd never been ill." "I've got over it. We women have as many lives as a cat," she said, timidly smiling and bowing her head. Griegor noticed the tenderly rosy, fluffy lobe of her ear and the yellowish skin at the nape of her neck through the strands of her hair and asked, "Is your hair falling out?" "It's almost all out. I'm molting all over. I shall be bald soon." "Let me shave your head?" he suggested suddenly. "What?" she exclaimed in alarm. "But then what will I look like?" "It's best to shave or the hair won't grow again." "Mamma promised to cut my hair with scissors," Natalia said, smiling in her embarrassment, and she dexterously threw a snow-white, heavily blued kerchief over her head. She, his wife, and the mother of Mishatka and Polyushka, was at his side. For him she had decked herself out and had washed her face with soap. Hurriedly flinging on her kerchief, so that he could not see how unsightly her hair had become since her illness, sitting there with her head bent slightly to one side, she looked so pitiful, so uncomely, and yet so beautiful, beaming with some pure, intrinsic beauty. She always wore high-standing collars, to hide from him the scar which disfigured her neck. It was all done for his sake. A tremendous flood of tenderness swept over Griegor's heart. He wanted to say something warm and kindly to her, but he could not find the words. And silently drawing her to himself, he kissed her white lofty brow and mournful eyes. Never before had he spoilt her with a caress. All her life Aksenia had stood in her path. Moved by her husband's display of feeling, flaming with agitation, she took his hand and raised it to her lips. For a minute they sat without speaking. The western sun threw livid rays into the room. The children were playing on the steps. As they sat, they heard Darya take the well-baked pipkins out of the oven and say discontentedly to her mother-in-law, "I'm afraid you haven't been milking the cows every day. The old one is yielding less milk, it looks like." The herd returned from the pasture. The cows lowed, the lads cracked the hairy lashes of their whips, the village bull bellowed hoarsely and spasmodically. His silky chest and steep, molded back were bitten to blood by gadflies. The bull shook his head angrily, raising the Astakhov's wattle fencing on his short, wide-set horns as he went along. He flung it down and trampled across it. Natalia looked out of the window and said, "You know, the bull retreated across the Don as well. Mother said that as soon as firing began in the villages, he swam straight across the river from his stall, plunged into the reeds, and hid there the whole time." Griegor was silent, lost in thought. Why had she got such mournful eyes? And then something secretive, elusive, first appeared, then disappeared again in them. Even in her joy she was sorrowful, and somehow incomprehensible. Perhaps she had heard rumors of his visits to Aksenia in Bieshenska. At last he asked, "Why are you so downcast today? What is lying on your heart, Natasha? You might tell me, won't you?" He expected tears, reproaches, but Natalia answered in a frightened tone, No, it only seems so to you. I'm all right. It's true I'm not quite well again yet. My head swims, and if I bend or pick something up, everything goes dark before my eyes." Griegor gazed at her inquisitively and asked again, "You've been all right here without me? Nobody interfered with you?" "No. What are you saying? I've been lying ill the whole time." She gazed right into his eyes and even smiled very faintly. After a silence, she asked, "Are you leaving early tomorrow?" "At dawn. But can't you spend another day here?" An uncertain, timid hope sounded in her voice. He shook his head, and she said with a sigh, "How will it be now? Have you got to wear epaulettes?" "I shall have to." "Well, then, take off your tunic, and I'll sew them on while it's still light." With a groan, Griegor drew off his tunic. It was still damp with his sweat. Wherever his military straps had rubbed the cloth, shiny spots showed wet on his back and shoulders. Natalia took a pair of faded khaki epaulettes out of the chest and asked, "Are these the ones?" "Yes, so you kept them." "We buried the chest," Natalia said indistinctly, as she pushed the thread through the needle-eye. Stealthily she raised the dusty tunic to her lips and avidly sniffed at the saltish scent of sweat which was so dear to her. "What did you do that for?" Griegor asked in astonishment. "It smells of you," she said, her eyes glittering. She bent her head to hide the sudden flush in her cheeks, and skillfully began to sew. Griegor put on his tunic. His face clouded, and he shrugged his shoulders. "You look better with them on," Natalia said, gazing at her husband in open admiration. But he squinted round at his left shoulder and sighed, "I wish I had never seen them. You don't understand at all." They remained sitting a long time on the chest in the best room, holding each other's hand, silently thinking their own thoughts. When dusk began to fall and the heavy lilac shadows of the buildings extended over the cool earth, they went into the kitchen for the evening. And so the night passed. Until sunrise, the summer lightning flickered in the sky. Until the white daybreak, the nightingales in the cherry orchard filled the night with tumult. Griegor woke up and lay a long time with closed eyes, listening to the nightingale's melodious and pleasant song. Then quietly, without arousing Natalia, he rose, dressed, and went out into the yard. Panteleimon Prokofyevitch had fed Griegor's horse, and with a soldier's forethought he suggested, "Shall I get on his back and give him a bath before you start?" "He can manage without it," Griegor said, bristling with the early morning rawness. "Did you sleep well?" his father asked. "Too well. But the nightingales woke me up. It's the limit, the way they carried on all night." Panteleimon took the grain basket from the horse and smiled. "They've got nothing else to do, lad. There are times when you feel envious of those divine birds. They know nothing about war or ruin." Prokhor rode up to the gate. His face was clean-shaven, and as usual he was cheerful and talkative. Fastening his horse's leading rein to a post, he came up to Griegor. His sailcloth shirt had been ironed smooth. On his shoulders were new-looking epaulettes. "So you've put epaulettes on too, Griegor Pantelyevitch," he shouted as he came up. "They've been waiting for us, damn them. Now we may wear them, but we'll never wear them out. They'll last out our time. I said to my wife, don't sew them on so they'll never come off, you fool. Just tack them on so that the wind can't blow them away, and that'll be all right. You know the state of our affairs. If we get taken prisoner, they'll see at once that I may not be an officer, but all the same I'm a senior non-com. And then they'll shout, 'You this and that. You knew how to earn your stripes, now learn how to hold your head for the noose. Do you see how they're hanging on me? It's just comic.'" Prokhor's epaulettes had certainly been sewn on hurriedly, and they hardly remained in position. Panteleimon burst into a roar of laughter. Untouched by time, his white teeth gleamed amid his grizzled beard. "There's a soldier for you. So if there's the least sign of anything happening, you'll be pulling off your epaulettes?" "What do you think?" Prokhor laughed. Smiling, Griegor said to his father, "You see what a fine orderly I've managed to get hold of? Even if I get into trouble, with him around I shall never get lost." "That's all very well, Griegor Pantelyevich, but you know, you die today, and I die tomorrow," Prokhor said in extenuation. He tore off his epaulets with the greatest ease and carelessly thrust them into his pocket, remarking, "When we get near the front I can sew them on again." Griegor ate a hurried breakfast, then took leave of his family. "May the Queen of Heaven preserve you," Ilinichna whispered fervently as she kissed her son. "You're the only one we've got left. Now, see me off and no tears." "Goodbye," Griegor said in a quivering voice, and went across to his horse. Throwing Ilinichna's black three-cornered kerchief over her head, Natalia went out beyond the gate. The children clung to her skirt. Polyushka sobbed disconsolately. Choking back her tears, she asked her mother, "Don't let him go. Don't let him go, Mummy. He'll be killed in the war. Daddy, don't ride off to the war." Mishatka's lips quivered, but he did not cry. He manfully restrained himself and angrily told his little sister, "Don't talk nonsense, idiot. Everybody isn't killed in the war." He firmly remembered his grandfather's words that Cossacks never cry, that it was a terrible shame for Cossacks to cry. But when his father, seated on his horse, raised him to the saddle and kissed him, he noticed with amazement that his father's eyelashes were wet, and then Mishatka could stand the test no longer. His tears poured like rain from his eyes. He hid his face against his father's chest, against the leather straps, and bellowed, "Let Granddad go and fight. What has he come back to us for? I don't want you to." Griegor carefully lowered his son to the ground, wiped the tears from his eyes with the back of his hand, and silently touched up his horse. How many times now had his charger torn up the earth by the steps of this hut with his hoofs? How many times had he carried him along the tracks and over the pathless steppe to the front, to where gloomy death marked down the Cossacks, to where, in the words of the Cossack song, there is fear and sorrow every day, every hour. But never had he ridden out of his village with so heavy a heart as on that gracious morning. Oppressed by vague presentiments which weighed him down with anxiety and foreboding, he rode with the reins over his saddle-bow as far as the hill crest before he looked back. At the crossroads, where the dusty road branched off towards the windmill, he turned his head. Only Natalia was standing at the gate, and the fresh early morning breeze was tearing her black mourning kerchief from her hands. Whipped into foam by the wind, the clouds floated on in the blue, still pool of the sky. A haze streamed along the flowing selvage of the horizon. The horses moved at a walking pace. Prokhor dozed, swaying in the saddle. Griegor, clenching his teeth, looked back again and again. For some time he could see the green clumps of willows, the silvery, capriciously winding ribbon of the dawn, the slowly turning sails of the windmill. Then the track turned sharply southward. The sedgy riverside, the dawn, the windmill vanished behind the trampled fields of grain. He began to whistle something, fixedly gazed at his horse's golden-brown neck with its fine beading of sweat, and turned no more in his saddle. To hell with it, with this war. Fighting had gone on along the Chira, then it had ranged along the Don, and now it would thunder by the Khoper, over Midvyetsita, over the Buzuluk, and in the last resort, what did it matter where the enemy's bullet sent him to the ground, he thought? This concludes the reading of The Dawn Flows Home to the Sea, Part 1 by Mikhail Sholokhov. This book was read by Wolfram Kandinsky.